Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Chapter 11. When will we memorialize the victims of our Holocaust? It is unfortunately forgotten that, during slavery and colonialism, Africa and its people suffered the greatest loss in population and cultural devastation of any people in history. There is no memorial calling attention to this event any place in all the world. The Africans in Africa have not properly memorialized their loss, and the Africans outside of Africa, the major victims of slavery and colonization, have erected no edifices or monument to remind their children that some of them survived the greatest protracted crime in history. I maintain that people of the entire African world, both in Africa and abroad, are delinquent in their responsibility to their ancestors until some proper memorials are erected in every place in the world where there is an African population. The subject is so big that it is frightening. I wonder why a people as large as we are, engaged in as many activities as we are engaged in, have waited so long to think of addressing ourselves to the subject. The Middle Passage, our Holocaust. It is our Holocaust because this is a Holocaust that started 500 years ago, and it is not over. We do not start our count at 6 million. We start counting at 60 million, and we have just begun to count. Now, I do not mean to negate the German and the European Holocaust. Whether the number was 60 or 60 million, even if it was 3 million, it was wrong. But it was a problem started in Europe by Europeans. There's no comparison between this tragedy and our tragedy, which was the greatest single crime in the history of the world. Why haven't we memorialized our dead? It was almost like the crime of not burying them. Let's look at it historically, broadside, before we come to the subject. Why are we, a people whom so many have said have no history, pursued by so many other people? Why is it that we have been a prize to be captured down through the years? It is because of a prevailing thing that prevails right now. African people have been under siege for over 3,000 years for the same reason they are under siege right now. African people have always had and still have something other people want, think they can't do without, and don't want to pray for. You keep using the word apartheid about South Africa. It is a minor issue in comparison to the real issue. The real issue in South Africa is a form of economic slavery. It is Western domination of the mineral wealth of South Africa, and subsequently the mineral wealth of the whole world. The assault on South Africa, the assault on Africa in general, is an assault on the gold in the Western Sudan, and there lies the major gold wealth of Africa. Except for it, the economic system under which you live would not be the same or even reasonably the same. Let us go to the background of the tragedy because very often you think that this happened quite by accident. Let's see the stage for what happened. It is too big for literature. Let's put it in the realm of theater. It was a world drama, a tragedy, and it started inside of the European mind. Let us look at the 200-year turning point in world history, 1400 to 1600 A.D. Let's look at where Europe was. Europe had just finished the period of the Crusades, one of the great phony charades of human history. It had nothing to do with religion. It was a political move to divert the attention of Europe from the fact that the church had played so many games on the people that the people were about to explode and destroy it. So they found an issue to divert the people's attention from that fact. Once they started them to marching and going to rescue the Holy Grail, which wasn't even lost in the first place, they would forget that they had been bled dry to build all those cathedrals so that all the priests and monks could live in luxury, while most of the population of Europe lived in poverty. They would forget that Europeans had, to a great extent, enslaved Europeans. Feudalism was still rampant in Europe. Now, to divert their attention, they needed an issue. The Crusades, the rescue of the Holy Grail, and the fight against the hated infidel became the great issue. The Africans and the Arabs had blocked the Europeans' entry to the Mediterranean since 711 A.D., when the African general Tariq bin Zayed had conquered Spain. It was an African-Arab partnership. Now, when the Arabs write history, they leave out the Africans, and when the Europeans write, they leave out the Africans. So, therefore, if you want to get in the story, you write the story. We're at the end of this dominance, the great flourishing period of scientific discovery. You assume that when Europe was having its Middle Ages, everyone else was having theirs. There were people in the world who had no Middle Age, no age of backwardness, no feudalism, and those people were in Africa, inner West Africa, the Western Sudan. 3 great, magnificent African states, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, unfolded while Europe was having its period of depression. The last of these states was now reaching the apex of its grandeur. In 1450, the Portuguese attacked a part of Morocco, a little place called Qatta, and for the first time a European had taken over some African territory. This put heart in Europe because they had at last invaded the territory of what they considered to be the hated infidel. At this juncture of history, everyone not of your chosen religion was considered to be an infidel. The European Christian called the Arab infidel, and the Arabs called the Christian infidel. They had been capturing each other in the Mediterranean, but for the first time the European Christian had taken some land from the African. In 1450, the Africans and the Arabs were having an argument in Spain, and this argument was weakening their hold on Spain. In 1455, Spain and Portugal had gained enough freedom from African Arab domination of the Mediterranean to go to the Pope to seek arbitration, because now they were getting colonial ambitions of their own. They said, once we are free of Moorish domination, what are we going to do? They were now talking about what part of the world they were going to take. The Pope, settling the argument, said, "You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people." He issued a papal bull to this effect. I'm assuming that some of you have read Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery. This event is well documented in other books, but best done in Capitalism and Slavery. Europe is awakening from its own lethargy. Prince Henrik, called Henry the Navigator, although there was no evidence that he ever went to sea, finds a cache of maps. The maps were used by Jewish gold dealers in the Western Sudan. The Jews had access to the Western Sudan before anyone else and in preference to others. This is another lecture for another day, but for over 3,000 years, people called Hebrews or Jews have been given preferred treatment over other people, a fact which they have never acknowledged to this day. They were given preferred treatment in the trade of gold in the Western Sudan, and they were the major gold dealers between Spain, the Mediterranean states, and the nations in Africa called the Western Sudan. They had made maps of the areas going into Western Sudan, and these are some of the maps that Henry the Navigator got a hold of to start his school of chart-making and map-making. Europe had lost the concepts of longitude and latitude, but they learned from the information gathered in Spain and preserved by the Africans and the Arabs, collectively called the Moors. At the University of Salamanca, there were only 2 great universities in the whole world at the time, Salamanca in Spain and Sankore at Timbuktu. There was no Harvard, no Cambridge, no Oxford. None of these schools were in existence. 2 universities in the whole world, one solely manned by Africans, Sankore at Timbuktu, one partly manned by Africans, Salamanca in Spain. They had translated the maritime information coming out of China, the leading maritime nation of the world of that day. With maritime knowledge, the European goes out to sea. The Africans have also preserved the intellectual masters of Europe, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, as well as some of the basis of European Christianity. The Europeans would now use that information and turn on the people who had preserved it. No one has ever sent us a thank you note for anything we ever did for them, which makes us a totally unobligated people. We owe no one anything, politically left or right. Everybody who has come among us has taken away more than they brought, and more than they gave. We have been humane to all the people we have met. No one ever fought their way into Africa. They came as guests and stayed as conquerors or slave traders. With Europeans beginning to see the light, they start looking for something to replenish their empty bowls. They are coming out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages. They have survived famines and plagues and lost 1/3 of their population. They are looking for the spices and sweets of the East. They were not looking for Africa at first. They were looking for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. And they discovered Africa en route. They discovered a richer prize while seeking a route to the East, and they captured this prize instead of pursuing the route to Asia. They would get to Asia and find Asia more politically sophisticated because the Asians were accustomed to conquerors and visitors with no good intentions. Europe would have to deal with the Asians in a different way. The Asians would have invited them to dinner, but they would have watched them through the dinner, and if they suspected that they had evil intentions, they might have slipped something into the food. But the Africans were generous, and that's why they were trapped. The Portuguese began to come down the coast of Africa in 1438, but didn't begin to take slaves out of Africa until 1442. Their taking of slaves out of Africa started with a misunderstanding of African internal servitude, which was based on the extraction of labor after war captivity. Many times Africans captured in internal wars, sometimes just skirmishes, had to work so many months or years as penalty for losing the war. There were no great casualties. After serving their period of indenture, they would go free. You lost a war, and that was what you had to do. Once there was an accumulation of labor over and above that, which could be used locally, since the Africans had no massive transportation, they began to use Portuguese ships to lend that labor to other kings or chiefs further down the coast. The Portuguese interpreted this as Africans enslaving other Africans, and subsequently used this as a rationale to do the same thing. The role of the Africans in the slave trade is still being misrepresented by Africans, African Americans, and especially white scholars who are not scholarly enough to understand that the Africans could not have possibly managed or set in motion anything as massive as the three-continent industry of the Western slave trade. Let us look at this turning point in history, this 200-year turning point, with Europe coming out of the Middle Ages and relearning the skill of shipping. Europe, having lost its sentimental attachment to itself and that of other people, then began to explode. We must look at the world after 1492, but even before that, there's a date you have to reconsider. 1482, when an expedition sailed down the coast of West Africa and demanded to build the fortress at El Mina. In this grouping of ships were sailors and soldiers waiting offshore, for if the king didn't buy the Bible story, he'd have to buy the gun story. The Portuguese forced their way in and built the first permanent fortification, El Mina Castle, the largest slave-holding fortress in all West Africa. In this expedition was a little-known sailor, Cristobal Colon, later known as Christopher Columbus. He said in his diary, "As man and boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years. What was he doing up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years? He was obviously in the early Portuguese slave trade. This is why once he and his disease-ridden men had almost destroyed the Caribs and the Arawaks, whom he mistakenly called Indians. He himself suggested bringing Africans to replace them. He had asked Father de la Casa to go to Rome to get sanction of the church to do so. And this Father de la Casa did. Of course, near the end of his life, Father de la Casa said that it was wrong to enslave the African as well as the Indian. That was 35 years later. The Indians were dead, and some of the Africans were dead. What I'm trying to look at is that the war on the African started before he got on the ship. This was a war waged on the structure of African society, especially the family, and that the attack on the black male started right there, and it continues to this day. The Color Purple was not a movie. It was a continuation of that war. You might have looked at it for entertainment, but that was not entertainment. It was propaganda, as skillfully put as the propaganda that came out of Nazi Germany. More skillful because blacks participated in it and rationalized about it and said it was art. I've gone through these slave forts, most of the major ones. I went through Gorée, the slave fort in the French area, and that's the third time I've gone through that one within the year. If you look at the structure, you see that it was designed so that the slave sellers lived in luxury over the slave dungeons below. Upon the onset of evening, the women would be assembled in the courtyard so that the captains could pick out the one they wanted to violate that night. And these Africans had not even left Africa yet. We see the beginning of a process which we have not dealt with as a people. Bastardization, when they not only bastardize the body, they bastardize the mind. Today you can find a jet black person with a bastardized mind. He doesn't know where his mind is or who he's loyal to or who his paymaster is. But that process of physical bastardization would begin there, and part of the mental bastardization would also begin there, because sometimes they kept back the mother and the bastard child, and they would later become part of the slave trade system in the village around the fort. But now, once the system got underway and the people were on their way to the various markets, we have another process, which is the same process in a slightly different way. This is a tragedy of such proportion that it taxes the imagination, and some blacks want to forget about it, and maybe this is why we have not memorialized our dead. This constitutes the greatest number of unmemorialized people in the history of the whole world. No other people have permitted that many of their people to die and have not attempted to make a suitable memorial for them. I say again, it's like having not buried them. It's like they are still there, like their voices are still there. They have left us with something. I remember speaking to Ray Charles once, and I was trying to explain the particular nature of the genius in his voice, and he didn't get the point, and I was kind of sorry that I had put it that way. I said, Ray, the particular genius in your voice is that of protracted crying. That's the wail and the crying in those slave ships coming back down through the genes and through the years. He shook his head and said, "Where did you get this crazy cat? I wish I could see him." He missed the point. I had never been more sincere in all my life. And I believe that the genius of our survival is what we have misunderstood. When we discuss the numbers lost in this trade, we are in an endless discussion of how many, and that depends on who you are listening to. If 20 million cleared through Goree, that's just one fortress and not even the largest one. 20 million cleared through that one place, and Goree was late in getting started. And the monster, the largest of the slave forts, was at Elmina Castle, whose dungeons could hold over 1,000 at one time. Let's put these together. Another figure to add is that of those lost in the movement from the hinterlands to the coast. Sometimes 7 out of 10 got lost. Sometimes slave catchers in competition with each other, or just for meanness and spite, killed each other's captives. That means that 100% got lost. 10 out of 10 got lost. Now, these are statistics that didn't get in anyone's computer. Some of the slave captains were thieves and cheats working for absentee slave owners. They would load, say, 350 slaves on a ship, list in their log 300, stop at a port, sell 50, and put the proceeds directly in their pocket. These statistics got lost. These statistics didn't get into anyone's computer, but the money got into their pockets. I'm saying that nearly every figure that you hear could be absolutely wrong, or could be partly right. But if it's a low figure, it is fully wrong. But understand what is happening now. There was no resource in all the world that Europe could get to rebuild its financial structure after the Middle Ages. The economy of Europe was rebuilt on the slave trade. That, except for this trade, the economy of Europe would not have pulled out of the depression of the Middle Ages, except for us and except for what was extracted from us. It did not start on its way to recovery in the United States, because the United States, in this early period, did not exist. The recovery started in the exploitation of the plantation system of the Caribbean islands. How the people got there was a double miracle, because a question arose between the slave sellers and shippers over tight pack versus loose pack. If they packed the slaves tight, we're talking about the Middle Passage itself. How, if they packed them tight in the ship, through suffocation, large numbers of them would die. From 1/3 to 1/2 wouldn't reach the market. But if they packed them loose, they'd have enough breathing space that a goodly number of them would live through the ordeal and get to the market. So the argument became, is it more economic to loose pack or tight pack? No one was talking about or thinking about Africans as human beings. Sometimes the sickly and the rebellious were just thrown overboard. The total dehumanization is what has to be looked at. In the establishment of South America and the Caribbean islands, something happened there that didn't happen in the United States. The slave masters brought in large lots and kept the lots together. They thought they could work them better that way. They were right, but they forgot the Africans could revolt better that way. They maintained cultural continuity to a great extent because they came from the same general area in Africa. They could speak the same language, and if you sold grandma or grandpa or uncle to someone on the other side of the island, they could walk to the other side of the island and see their relatives once in a while. There was a language that all of them understood, and that was the language of the drum. In the United States, they outlawed all African instruments and African religion, and this left the African in the United States without anything other than mental recall. Here, they bought in small lots and broke those lots up. When people do that, they break up the African loyalty system. We suffer to this day because they broke our loyalty system. This breakage caused the creation of a cleavage between the field black and the house black. That's what Malcolm X was trying to explain. Now you can understand why in South America and in the Caribbean, many slave revolts were planned and executed by house servants, while in the United States, many of them were betrayed by house servants. It has nothing to do with which one of those people were braver than the other. By breaking our cultural continuity, they broke the line of loyalty one to the other. We look at those people in the house and we say, we don't know what tribe he came from. He didn't come from my tribe. I can tell by the scars on his face he didn't come from my tribe. So I don't have any loyalty to him. He's up there eating food in the house while I'm out here eating this coarse food in the field. I don't have any feeling toward him. Who is he? But the man in the field in the Caribbean and the one in the house can tell by the speech and by the look of the other that they came from the same basic area in Africa and possibly from the same group. Caribbeans misunderstood this to this day. Most black Americans never knew it. But we have got to study both. I studied it several ways. But I say if we're ever going to affect some kind of unity, understand that we've got to look at all of the Africans who were brought here. And we will have to pay some special attention to those in South America, especially Brazil, where the largest number exists today. They did more with African culture continuity and with the consistency of it than any Africans in the New World, including Haiti. Did more with it by establishing 2 African states in Brazil, Bahia and Palmeiras, one of which lasted 110 years. What I was trying to show is that in a collective way, through the Africans in the Middle Passage, and through what was extracted from them, an economy came into being, and that economy made possible the modern technical and scientific world of the West. That world that was built on our sweat and our labor and our death now says that we cannot do when they struck at Africa, when Africa was on the verge of a pre-industrial age. We will never know what Africa could have been because they struck while Africa was growing. The internal differences between African state and African state were far less than some internal differences between European state and European state right now. But the African suffered from a kind of naivete he is still suffering from. He permitted Europeans to arbitrate his family disputes. Today in Africa, if there is a dispute, sometimes even a child can arbitrate. The African always looks for an arbitrator. It is part of his custom. If there is a dispute or a fight, the African looks around and says, "Now, who's going to settle this thing? I've been in Africa and saw a man and woman fighting. They were arguing, not a physical fight, just an argument. First time I didn't know what to do because this lady called me over and said, 'I have won this argument and I'm tired of it. Come here, settle this thing.' I didn't know what it was about or what I was supposed to do. She said, 'Finish, I won the argument. Now, settle it so that I can go on my way.' She wasn't going to move until someone said it was settled. They thought that the whites were just arbitrators, but they did not know that the whites would turn on them and put one against the other and conquer both of them. In many cases, this is what was done. Because of their African continuity, the slave revolts in the Caribbean islands and South America were more successful. But there were slave revolts all over. When you say maroons, most people think that you are talking about people in Jamaica. That's just a word for a runaway slave. There were maroons in the United States who ran to the hills and set up settlements and never submitted to slavery. All over South America, there was a consistency in revolt, and that there was a consistency in trying to maintain cultural continuity. In this country, you will find the remains of African customs very plainly spelled out in parts of New Orleans. But New Orleans was under French rule, and the French also bought in large lots and kept the lots together. You'll find where people were permitted to sell without being sold and resold rapidly. They managed to hold themselves together. Now, the purpose of this book itself, why haven't we as a people, without asking foundations to do it, why haven't we set up a suitable memorial for the Africans who died in the Middle Passage? Why haven't we done it ourselves? We haven't done it in the past. Why can't we do it now, although belatedly? Why can't we also have a slave museum either adjacent to it or separate from it to preserve, so that our children will remember the chains and the neck irons and the foot irons and the leg irons? This is what we came through, and we are obligated never to let this happen again. First, we are obligated never to let it happen again to us. This is our first obligation and the world's obligation. After we take care of the first, is to join others of goodwill, if you can find them, to make sure that it never happens to anybody else in the whole world. But don't take care of the world before you take care of your kith and kin. And don't apologize for giving preference to your case before you get on to other cases. What we have to do at this juncture in history is to locate ourselves on the map of human geography and shape ourselves for tomorrow so that we will be in a position that this will never happen again. We have to shake off and get rid of some of the naive attitudes we have towards ourselves, toward culture, toward words like civilization, which is misused anyway, toward what we are going to have to do, toward people of our own group that we have misunderstood, toward concepts of nation and nation management, toward where we are in the world, toward our national population and our international population. We must take into consideration that in the West Indies, in South America, and in the United States, there are easily 250 million African people. In the South Sea Islands, the Pacific Islands, in India, and parts of Asia, maybe another 50 million. There are over 300 million Africans living outside of Africa. There are 500 million Africans in Africa. In the 21st century, there will be 1 billion African people on the face of the earth. Where is our economy going to come from? If we built a shoe factory and made shoes for that many people, our shoe factories would be running all night and all day. If we just think of serving each other, look what we can have. I'm saying that we have to start thinking nation, thinking alliances. The first alliance being with ourselves, because out of the Middle Passage and those who survived it came that making of a new civilization, a whole new way of life. If there are any people strong enough to have survived, they're strong enough to remake the world. If we can do this, we can do anything. The one thing, in conclusion, that I'm asking you not to do is to forgive and forget. Your mission is to remember and to teach your children so that they can remember it. Because it happened to us, we have a special responsibility to ourselves to build a kind of humanity in partnership with all African people of the world that could serve as a role model for all of the people in the world. I'm not saying that we have to be nicer than other people in the goody-good sense. I'm not talking about that at all. And I'm not talking about nonviolence. I am saying we are fortunate because the entire continent of Africa, every inch of it, belongs to us. No matter who is there, who lives in Africa, all of it is ours, and we don't have to quote scriptures to prove it. We are the only people with a continent that belongs solely to us. Once you put African people, their energy and their imagination together, and once they begin to feed into each other and support each other, there is no need for them to conquer anybody or threaten anybody. And they, above all other people, can offer the world a whole new humanity and a new way of life. They might be the only people who can give this world some kind of security because they can see the utter stupidity of atomic weaponry because they want to live and have proven it. I think the fools who are playing with it now also want to live, but they think they can use it and kill others and still live themselves. I think that bringing all these African people together will show the world that it would be a better place by virtue of them coming together and being successfully dependent upon themselves and delivering goods and services to themselves. They will improve not only the economy of the world, but the spirit of the world and the humanity of the world and the dignity of the world. But they will have to get some illusions out of their minds first. They have to develop an entirely different concept of education. Powerful people never educate you in how to take their power away from them, and their schools are not going to give you the kind of education you need. You have to make it or take it. When you get the kind of education you need, you will discover the green fields of Africa, and you won't have to go to Africa to improve Africa. Africa is where you are. You start with your community and with yourself, and then you will begin to see and understand revolutionary change. The greatest memorial that can be to the people of the Middle Passage, while I call for and strongly suggest a physical memorial, in addition to a museum of slavery, preserving the ornamentations, the chains, and atrocities so that our children will know that it wasn't easy, would be to remind them of the work they still have to do. I think that the greatest change is going to have to be with each one of you, and your greatest memorial to those who died in the Middle Passage will be what each individual one of you does to bring revolutionary change to yourself and to your community. I think you should start with a mirror. You look into the mirror until you like what you see, and then you say, my revolution starts with me, and my memorial to the people in the Middle Passage starts right now. The end.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.